Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we are going to walk through one of the most consequential stories in human history. The Roman Empire. Not just the wars and the emperors, though there are plenty of both, but the people who built roads through marshes and mountains, the soldiers who slept in tents on the Rhine for 20 years, the women who ran households and businesses, the slaves who kept the whole thing moving, and the engineers who solved problems that other civilizations had not yet thought to ask. Rome lasted, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. It left behind its language, its laws, its roads, its calendar, and its idea of what a city should look like. Many of the places you can visit in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa still carry the bones of what Rome built. Some of those bones are still in use. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are somewhere cold with rain on the window or somewhere warm with a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, I am glad you are here. Now, let us begin. The hills above the Tiber. The river runs brown and wide in most seasons. It floods in winter when the rains come off the hills, and it drops to a shallow ribbon in the dry heat of late summer. At a point about 20 kilometers from the sea, the river bends around a long flat island. On both banks, a set of low hills rises from the floodplain. The hills are not tall. They are more like broad ridges, separated by shallow valleys and small streams that run into the Tiber. The ground on top of the hills is dry. The valleys between them are wet and full of reeds and standing water in the rainy months. People had been living around this river crossing for a long time before anyone decided to call the place Rome. Settlements on the Palatine Hill and the Capitoline Hill go back to at least the 10th century before the Common Era. Huts with thatched roofs, small clusters of people who kept pigs and grew emmer wheat on cleared ground near the water. The Latin tribes and other peoples of the region, the Sabines, the Etruscans to the north, the Oscans farther south, all moved through this landscape and left traces in the soil. The traditional date for the founding of Rome is 753 BCE. Roman writers in later centuries calculated it from the names of kings and worked backward from their own present. The actual founding was not a single moment with a plough and a furrow. It was the slow merging of several hilltop villages into something bigger, probably helped by the Etruscan kings who ruled the early city and brought with them the skills of drainage, stone construction, and organized religion that the Latin farmers of the hills did not yet have. The Etruscans are worth a moment on their own. They had towns, written language, a sophisticated art tradition, and wide trading contacts with Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. They introduced the arch into Italian construction, and the Romans learned it well. For a period in the late 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Etruscan kings sat on the Roman throne. They drained the marshy valley between the hills and turned it into the Forum, a flat, open space that became the heart of Roman public life for the next several centuries. Under Etruscan rule, Rome grew from a cluster of villages into a proper town with a stone-paved main square, a circuit of walls, and temples on the high points. Then, the kings were expelled. Roman tradition places this in 509 BCE and ties it to an act of violence by the king's son against a Roman noblewoman. Whether that specific story is true or not, the result is well attested in later records. The Roman aristocracy, the patricians, took control and built a system of government that would define the city for the next 5 centuries. They called it the Republic and the men who ran it. The Republic was not a democracy in the way some modern people use the word. Power was shared, but it was shared among a fairly small group of wealthy families who kept tight control over which offices were open to whom and how decisions were made. The 2 men called consuls were elected each year to lead the state. Each could veto the other. Below them sat the Senate, a body of several hundred senior men, mostly from established families, who advised on foreign policy, managed state finances, and controlled the assignment of military commands. Below the Senate were various popular assemblies that could pass laws and elect magistrates, but had less practical power than the Senate itself. The arrangement was designed to prevent any one man from accumulating too much power. It worked better in some periods than others. The city itself grew. By the 4th century BCE, It was a serious power in central Italy, fighting wars against the Gauls who raided from the north and against the Latin cities and Samnite hill tribes to the south. These wars were hard and often went badly at first. In 390 BCE, a Gallic force sacked Rome itself and had to be paid to leave. The Romans rebuilt the city with new walls and carried on. The Roman army during the Republic was not a professional force in the early centuries. It was a citizen militia called up for a campaign season and sent home when the fighting ended. Men who owned property above a certain threshold were obliged to serve and to bring their own equipment. Poorer men served in lower grades or not at all. This arrangement suited a city fighting seasonal wars against nearby enemies. It became harder to sustain as Rome's wars grew longer and farther away. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. It did this not only by force, but by making alliances with Italian towns and offering various grades of citizenship and legal status to different groups. Some towns became full Roman citizens. Others became Latin allies with partial rights. Others were bound to Rome by treaty with their own local laws intact. This network of relationships gave Rome a large and renewable pool of soldiers and created a web of interests that generally held together even under severe pressure. The pressure came in the form of Carthage. Carthage and the wars that changed everything. Carthage was a city on the North African coast in what is now Tunisia. It had been founded by Phoenician traders from the city of Tyre, probably in the 9th century BCE. By the 3rd century, it was one of the wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean world, controlling a trading empire that stretched across North Africa, into Spain, and across the islands of Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. Though Rome and Carthage came into conflict over Sicily in 264 BCE. What began as a dispute over a Sicilian city turned into a war that lasted 23 years. This was the First Punic War, and it changed Rome in ways that went beyond the military outcome. Rome had no significant navy at the start. It built one. Roman carpenters reportedly used a captured Carthaginian warship as a template and built their fleet in months. Roman engineers added a boarding bridge called the corvus to their ships, turning naval battles into something more like land fights where Roman infantry could board and overpower enemy crews. The technique was not always reliable and sometimes capsized Roman ships in bad weather, but it gave the Romans tactical options they had not had before. Rome won the First Punic War and took Sicily as its first overseas province. The cost had been enormous. Tens of thousands of Roman and Allied soldiers were dead. Several Roman fleets had been lost to storms as much as to enemy action. The treasury was strained. But Rome was now a naval power and a Mediterranean power, not just an Italian one. The Second Punic War, which began in 218 BCE, was a different kind of test. A Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca led an army from Spain, across the Alps, and into northern Italy. The crossing of the Alps in late autumn killed many of his men and most of his war elephants. He arrived in Italy with a reduced force, but with his cavalry intact. His Numidian horsemen from North Africa were among the best in the Mediterranean world, and Hannibal knew how to use them. Over the next 15 years, Hannibal won battles against Roman armies at the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene, and most severely at Cannae in 216 BCE. At Cannae, Hannibal's force of roughly 50,000 men surrounded a Roman army estimated at around 70,000 and killed the great majority of them in a single afternoon. It remains one of the largest battlefield defeats in ancient history and is still studied in military academies. The Roman dead at Cannae included 80 senators and 2 former consuls. Rome did not surrender. It raised new armies, imposed new taxes, and changed its strategy. Rather than seeking a decisive battle against Hannibal in Italy, Rome fought a war of attrition. It kept armies in the field to shadow Hannibal and prevent him from taking major cities, while simultaneously fighting Carthaginian forces in Spain and preparing an eventual strike at Africa itself. The man who led the African campaign was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus. He defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE on North African soil. Carthage surrendered, paid a large indemnity, and gave up its military independence. The Second Punic War cost Rome more than the First. Whole regions of southern Italy had been depopulated. Farms had been abandoned. The social structure of the countryside was shifting. Large landowners bought up failed farms and worked them with slaves taken in the wars. Smaller farmers who had been away on military service for years came home to find their land sold or ruined. The gap between the wealthy Roman nobility and the poor citizens of the city and countryside widened during the 2nd century BCE and kept widening. Be an empire. Without a name. Rome did not set out to build an empire with clear borders and a central plan. It accumulated territory the way water finds its way downhill, through the paths of least resistance shaped by particular pressures and opportunities. After the Punic Wars, Rome found itself increasingly involved in the affairs of the Greek kingdoms that had been carved out of Alexander the Great's conquests in the eastern Mediterranean. These kingdoms, in Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt, had been fighting each other for a century. They asked Rome to arbitrate their disputes, then found that Roman arbitration generally came with Roman soldiers attached. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome had fought wars in Greece and Macedonia and turned both into Roman provinces. It had defeated the Seleucid kingdom in Anatolia and imposed a peace settlement that pushed its power eastward. In 146 BCE, in the same year that Carthage was finally destroyed after a third and shorter war, Roman forces also sacked the Greek city of Corinth. Spain, Sardinia, Sicily, North Africa, Greece, Macedonia, parts of Anatolia. By 100 BCE, Rome had territory ringing most of the Mediterranean. It did not yet call itself an empire. It was still legally a republic, still electing consuls, still holding Senate meetings. But the republic was straining under the weight of its own success. The armies had changed. A general named Gaius Marius, elected consul multiple times in the late 2nd century during a crisis involving wars in North Africa and the threat of large Germanic tribes in the north. He had reformed the army into a professional force. Soldiers now served for pay over long terms, received equipment from the state rather than their own pockets, and were organized into the standardized heavy infantry legions that most people now associate with Rome. At the end of their service, soldiers expected land grants from their commanders. This tied soldiers to their generals in ways that went well beyond military loyalty. The result played out over the following decades in a series of civil conflicts that tore the Republic apart. Marius himself fought a civil war against his former subordinate Sulla. Sulla marched his legions on Rome twice, something no Roman commander had ever done. He won, imposed a dictatorship, reorganized the Senate, and then voluntarily resigned and died shortly after, which few people had expected. The institutions of the Republic survived, but were now clearly available to anyone who could command enough loyal soldiers. Caesar, the Crossing, and the aftermath. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman political world was defined by 3 men of exceptional ability and ambition. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, having made his fortune partly through buying burning buildings cheaply and having his private fire brigade put out the fire before completing the sale. Gnaeus Pompeius, called Pompey, had built a military reputation through campaigns in Spain against Mediterranean pirates and in the eastern kingdoms. Gaius Julius Caesar was a member of an old but not especially wealthy patrician family, deeply in debt, with a talent for popular politics and personal charm. These 3 formed an informal alliance in 60 BCE, and agreeing to support each other's interests and block their senatorial opponents. Caesar used the arrangement to get himself a military command in Gaul, the region that is now France and parts of Belgium and Switzerland. Caesar's Gallic campaigns ran from 58 to 50 BCE. He fought a series of wars against the Gallic tribes, crossed the Rhine into Germanic territory twice to demonstrate Roman reach, and crossed the English Channel twice to probe Britain. He wrote his own account of these campaigns in plain, clear Latin that was read by educated Romans back in the city. The account was partly a military record and partly a political document, keeping his name and his successes in front of the Roman public while he was away. Gaul was brought under Roman control at significant cost to the Gallic population. The estimates of the dead and enslaved in these campaigns run into the millions, though ancient numbers are always difficult to verify precisely. A major revolt under a leader named Vercingetorix in 52 BCE nearly reversed everything Caesar had achieved. Caesar's response was to besiege Vercingetorix at a hill fort called Alesia, and, when a large relief army arrived to break the siege, to build a second ring of fortifications facing outward while keeping the inner ring around the fort. He was simultaneously besieging Alesia and defending against the relieving force with the same army. The Gallic relief force was defeated. Vercingetorix surrendered and was later executed in Rome. Crassus had died in 53 BCE in a disastrous campaign against Parthia in the east. His army was destroyed at a place called Carrhae by Parthian horse archers who refused to stand still and be fought in the Roman manner. With Crassus gone, the alliance between Caesar and Pompey unraveled into rivalry and then open conflict. The Senate, backed by Pompey, ordered Caesar to give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, which would have left him exposed to prosecution by his enemies. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the small river in northern Italy that marked the boundary beyond which a general was not permitted to bring armed troops, in January 49 BCE. The phrase crossing the Rubicon has survived as a description of any point of no return. Caesar crossed it with one legion, the 13th. The rest of his forces were still in Gaul and moving south to join him. The crossing was an act of war against the Roman state. Caesar knew this and chose it anyway. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey lasted from 49 to 45 BCE, fought across Italy, Spain, Greece, and Egypt. Pompey was defeated at Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BCE and fled to Egypt, where he was killed on the beach by Egyptian courtiers who thought that killing him would please Caesar. It did not please Caesar. He went to Egypt himself, became involved in the Egyptian court's own civil war, supported Cleopatra against her brother, and stayed for nearly a year. He then fought campaigns in the eastern Mediterranean, Africa, and Spain before returning to Rome. Caesar held the title of dictator, a legitimate Roman office meant to be used in emergencies for fixed terms, but by 44 BCE, he had been appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. Several senators who saw this as the permanent end of the Republic killed him on the Ides of March. The 15th of March, 44 BCE, in a hall adjacent to the theatre of Pompey. 23 stab wounds, according to an ancient physician's account, though apparently only one was immediately fatal. The conspirators had a plan to kill Caesar, but no plan for what came after. The result was another round of civil wars, this time between Caesar's named heir and adopted son Octavian, the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and various senatorial factions. By 31 BCE, after the naval battle of Actium off the Greek coast, Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra both died the following year. Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian returned to Rome and spent the next several years carefully rearranging the Roman political system while keeping the forms of the Republic intact. He was given the title Augustus, meaning something close to revered or dignified, by the Senate. He held tribunician power, which gave him the right to veto any law and the legal person of a tribune, who was protected from physical harm. He commanded the armies through his control of the frontier provinces where the legions were stationed. He managed the treasury. He controlled foreign policy. In practice, he held power over the whole Roman state, but he presented himself as the first citizen, the princeps, rather than as a king or a dictator. The word emperor, from the Latin imperator, meant at first simply a military commander acclaimed by his troops. Over time, it came to mean something else. The Augustan settlement held. Augustus ruled until 14 CE, a reign of over 40 years, the longest effective rule of any single Roman leader. He spent his reign consolidating the frontiers, rebuilding Rome in marble, patronizing literature and architecture, and managing a succession problem that would trouble his successors for centuries. The city that ate the world. Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE was a city of around 1 million people. No city in Europe would reach that size again until London did so in the 19th century. Feeding 1 million people in antiquity was a serious logistical challenge. The city imported grain from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. The grain came in ships that docked at the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber and was moved upriver to the city on barges. The state distributed a grain ration to something between 100 and 200,000 male Roman citizens, a system called the annona that had been running in various forms since the late Republic. The city had bakers who worked through the night, thousands of them. Bread was baked in clay ovens heated with wood, and the loaves were round and dense, often stamped with the baker's mark. Carbonized loaves from Pompeii, preserved by the volcanic ash of the Vesuvius eruption in 79 CE, show exactly this. One bakery in Pompeii had 81 loaves in the oven when the eruption hit. Water came into Rome through aqueducts, 11 of them by the 2nd century CE. These were engineering works of the first order. The aqueducts ran for distances of up to 90 kilometers, maintaining a precise downward gradient that kept the water moving by gravity alone. Where the route crossed a valley, the aqueduct was carried on a row of arches. The arches were built from concrete, a Roman material made from volcanic ash, lime, and aggregate that sets hard even underwater. Roman concrete is the reason so many Roman structures are still standing. The concrete itself is the structure, not a coating over something else. The Pantheon in Rome, a temple converted into a church, has a concrete dome that is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, nearly 2,000 years after it was built. The water arrived at Rome in quantities far beyond what any individual household needed for drinking and cooking. Much of it went to the public baths and the thermae. Bathing in Rome was a social activity as much as a hygienic one. The great bath complexes, the baths of Caracalla and the baths of Diocletian being among the largest, could hold thousands of people at once. They had cold rooms, warm rooms, hot rooms, exercise yards, libraries and shops. A visit to the baths on a free afternoon was something that a Roman of any class below the very poor could participate in, since the entry fee was low or sometimes waived. The city was also loud, crowded, and smelled of many things, not all of them pleasant. Multi-story apartment blocks called insulo packed people into rented rooms. The ground floors, which were cooler in summer and had direct access to the street, tended to be occupied by shops and wealthier tenants. Upper floors were cheaper and more dangerous, and being farther from water sources and more vulnerable to fire. Rome had professional fire brigades, the Vigiles, 7,000 men divided into 7 cohorts, each responsible for 2 of Rome's 14 administrative districts. They also functioned as a night police force. Fires were frequent. The streets of Rome were paved with large flat stones, many of which are still in place. They were narrow, noisy during the day, with pedestrians, vendors, and litters carrying wealthy citizens, and congested with carts at night, since wheeled vehicles were banned during daylight hours in most of the city centre. The ban was practical, but created its own problem, as the cart traffic that moved goods through the city at night generated considerable noise. Rich Romans lived in townhouses called domus, built around a central atrium open to the sky and a garden courtyard beyond it. The walls were plastered and painted in red, ochre, blue, and green. Floors were laid with mosaic. The domus had a public-facing side, where the owner received clients and conducted business, and a private side where family life happened. Roman aristocrats spent a good deal of their mornings receiving clients, people of lower social rank who came to pay their respects and ask for favors, in a daily ritual called the salutatio. Outside Rome, wealthy Romans had country estates, the villa. A villa was both a working agricultural property and a comfortable house. It produced olive oil, wine, grain, and livestock, managed by a household of slaves under a manager called a villicus. The owner might visit a few times a year to oversee operations, entertain guests, read, write letters, and escape the heat and noise of the city. Some of the finest Roman writing was done on these estates. Cicero wrote letters from his various villas. Pliny the Younger wrote descriptions of his coastal and lakeside properties that still read vividly. The legions and the frontiers. The army that held the empire together numbered, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, CE somewhere between 300 and 400,000 men, divided into roughly 30 legions of about 5,000 heavy infantry each, plus a roughly equal number of auxiliary troops, non-citizen soldiers recruited from the provinces who served in cavalry units, specialist infantry, and various other formations. Each legion was a self-contained military force. It had infantry, its own artillery in the form of bolt shooting and stone-throwing machines called ballistae and onagri, its own engineering capacity, its own medical facilities, and its own administrative staff. A legion on campaign could build a fortified camp in a matter of hours, with a regular layout of streets, tents or barracks, headquarters, hospital, granary, and latrines. The men built the same camp every time they stopped, so that soldiers who moved between legions and served in different parts of the empire always knew where everything was. The soldiers' equipment was standardized. The heavy infantry legionary in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE carried a rectangular shield called a scutum, curved to wrap around the body, faced with a central iron boss. He threw a heavy javelin called a pilum at close range before closing, with a short stabbing sword called the gladius. The pilum was designed to bend on impact, preventing the enemy from throwing it back and also weighing down the shield of anyone unlucky enough to take one in it. The legionary wore a segmented iron armor called laritza segmentata over a wool tunic. He carried a dagger, a kit of personal tools and supplies for several days on his back. Service lasted 20 years for a legionary, 25 for an auxiliary. A soldier could not legally marry during service, though long-term relationships with local women near permanent forts were common and produced children who often themselves joined the army. At the end of service, a legionary received a discharge bonus, land or cash, and full citizenship if he had not already held it. An auxiliary received citizenship on discharge as a matter of course, and his children were citizens from birth. The diploma recording this grant, 2 bronze tablets wired together and stamped with the emperor's seal, has been found in many provinces. The frontiers of the empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE ran along the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe, through the Syrian desert in the east, along the edge of the Sahara in North Africa, and behind Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain. These were not impermeable barriers. They were defended lines through which controlled movement happened. Traders, travelers, and diplomats crossed regularly. The frontier zones were densely administered, with customs posts, military roads, watchtowers, and civilian settlements that grew up around permanent forts. Hadrian's Wall, built starting in 122 CE across the narrowest point of northern Britain, is 80 kilometers long. It was built of stone in the east and turf in the west, about 3 meters thick, and originally around 5 to 6 meters tall, with a series of forts along its length and smaller intermediate towers every Roman mile. It was garrisoned by auxiliary units, mostly from continental provinces, Gauls, Germans, Dacians, Syrians, North Africans. An inscription from one of the wall forts records a unit of Harmian archers from the region of the Syrian city of Hama, serving on the cold and wet northern British frontier. A writing tablet from the fort at Vindolanda, preserved in the waterlogged ground, records an invitation to a birthday party, a request for more beer, a complaint about the lack of decent hunting gear, and a report on the local British people, describing them as not using armor and riding in large numbers of cavalry. Everyday life written in ink on thin slivers of wood 2,000 years ago. The Rhine frontier was backed by a road system that allowed legions to move rapidly from one trouble spot to another. The permanent legionary fortresses at places like Cologne, Mainz, and Xanten grew into major cities, the core of medieval and modern settlements. Cologne, Colonia Agrippinensis in Roman times, was founded as a colony of Roman citizens in 50 CE. It had a forum, temples, aqueducts, baths, and a population of perhaps 40,000 at its height. It is still a large city, still on the same river crossing, still with sections of Roman wall visible in its downtown area. The provinces and the people who lived in them. The empire at its greatest extent, under Trajan in the early 2nd century CE, stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from Morocco to the Black Sea. Within that territory lived somewhere between 50 and 80 million people, speaking dozens of languages. worshipping hundreds of gods, living under varying local customs and laws, all nominally under the authority of one man in Rome. How that authority was actually felt depended enormously on where you lived and who you were. In the city of Rome itself, the emperor's presence was constant and visible in his building programs, his games, the distribution of grain and money on special occasions. In a village in central Anatolia, a farmer might go through an entire lifetime feeling Roman authority only through the tax collector and the occasional passing of soldiers on a military road. The tax system required provinces to produce a regular census of property and persons. Tax was levied on land, on inheritance, on sales of slaves, on trade crossing provincial boundaries. Collection was done partly by government officials and partly by local elites who were responsible for delivering a set amount and could keep any surplus, an arrangement that created incentives for efficiency and also for corruption. The local elites of the provinces were crucial to how the empire functioned. Rome governed through them. A provincial town was run by a council of decurions, men of property who held local magistracies, managed the town's finances, and were responsible for public works and religious ceremonies. Membership on the council was both an honor and a financial obligation. Decurions were expected to contribute their own money to building projects, festivals, and the grain supply in bad years. The records of Roman provincial towns are full of inscriptions recording who donated what: a new market building, a stretch of road paving, a public banquet, a set of statues. The donor's name was prominently recorded. Euergetism, the Greek word for benefaction, was how towns got things built. Many of the provincial elites eventually received Roman citizenship and moved into the broader Roman world of offices and careers. The process accelerated over time. By the 2nd century CE, emperors themselves were coming from the provinces. Trajan and Hadrian were from Roman Spain. Septimius Severus, who ruled from 193 to 211 CE, was from the North African city of Leptis Magna, in what is now Libya. His mother spoke Latin. His first language was Punic, the Semitic language descended from Phoenician. He never fully lost his accent. His wife, Julia Domna, was from the city of Emesa in Syria. Their son Caracalla, who in 212 CE issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, granting Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire, was the product of North African and Syrian ancestry, ruling from a city in Italy. The Constitutio Antoniniana was a decision of enormous practical significance. Roman citizenship had been a legally privileged status since the early Republic, carrying rights to vote in assemblies, to stand for office, to make legal contracts and wills under Roman law, and to appeal legal decisions to Rome. Extending it to all free people in the empire changed the character of what citizenship meant. It also had a fiscal dimension, since some taxes were levied only on citizens. Women in the Roman provinces lived within a legal framework that gave them more formal rights than in many other ancient societies, but fewer than men. A Roman woman could own property, inherit, make contracts, and conduct business, but she was expected to have a male guardian, called a tutor, for significant legal transactions. In practice, wealthy women could and did manage large estates, conduct commercial operations, and exert considerable influence through family networks. Inscriptions from all over the empire record women as benefactors of their towns, donors to temples, priestesses of local cults. A woman named Eumachia in Pompeii built a large public building in the Forum and dedicated it to Pietas and Concordia. Her statue, found in the building's courtyard, shows her in the dress of a respectable Roman matron. Slavery was woven throughout the Roman economy at every level. The large agricultural estates of Italy were worked by enslaved people. Mines in Spain and elsewhere used enslaved labor in conditions that killed people within a few years. Urban households kept enslaved people as domestic servants, cooks, tutors, secretaries, and skilled craftspeople. The empire's administration relied partly on educated enslaved people who managed correspondence, kept accounts, and ran offices. A slave who belonged to the emperor's household, the familia Caesaris, could hold a position of significant administrative authority over free Roman citizens. The sources of enslaved people were primarily military conquest, which flooded the slave market after major campaigns, piracy, and the children of enslaved mothers, who were born into slavery. In better times, the children of slave women who had formed long-term relationships with free men sometimes received freedom. The legal category of the freedman, a former slave who had been formally emancipated, sat between slave and full citizen. Freedmen could own property, conduct business, and marry, but faced some legal restrictions. Their children were full citizens. Many freedmen became prosperous in trade and manufacture, and Roman literature treats the figure of the wealthy freedman with a mixture of admiration and social unease. Roads, law, and the sinews of the state. The Roman road system covered something like 400,000 kilometers at the height of the empire. The main roads, the Via Publicae, were built to a standard specification. The roadbed was excavated and laid with layers of stone, gravel, and concrete. The surface was paved with fitted stone slabs on the main routes through towns and across difficult terrain. The roads were straight wherever the topography allowed, not because Roman engineers did not know how to curve a road, but because a straight road is shorter and allows easier column movement and visual communication between points. Milestones stood every Roman mile, about 1.48 modern kilometers, recording the distance to the nearest major town, the name of the emperor who built or repaired the road, and sometimes the name of the provincial governor. Thousands of milestones have survived. They function as a kind of advertisement for imperial power spread across the landscape, as well as a practical navigation aid. A government courier system called the cursus publicus allowed the rapid movement of official messages and officials across the empire. Relay stations, the mansions, were set at intervals along the main roads, providing fresh horses, accommodation, and meals for official travelers. A courier could cover roughly 80 kilometers in a day on the main routes. News of an emperor's death could reach most provincial capitals within a few weeks of the event. Roman law is probably the most lasting legacy of the Roman Empire in the institutional sense. The legal traditions of most of continental Europe, and through European colonial expansion, much of Latin America and other parts of the world are rooted in Roman law. The development of Roman law is a centuries-long process, beginning in the early Republic with a written law code, the 12 Tables, and elaborated over time by jurists whose opinions were collected, argued over, and eventually codified. The great Roman jurists of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, men like Gaius, Papinian, Ulpian, and Paul, produced an enormous body of legal analysis covering property rights, contracts, inheritance, obligations, criminal procedure, and personal status. Their works were eventually brought together in the 6th century CE under the direction of the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian into a comprehensive legal code called the Corpus Juris Civilis. This text was rediscovered in medieval Europe and became the foundation of university legal education and practical law in many countries. Roman courts distinguished between civil law, covering disputes between private parties, and criminal law, covering offences against the state. The principle that the accused had the right to face their accuser was established in Roman procedure. The burden of proof in criminal cases rested on the accuser. Torture of free persons in legal proceedings was technically limited, though the limits were not always observed. The famous statement attributed to the jurist Ulpian that all persons are equal before the law was an aspiration rather than a consistent practice, but it was articulated and recorded, and that matters. The 5 good emperors and what made them good. The period from 96 to 180 CE is often referred to as the period of the 5 good emperors, a term coined by the later thinker Niccolò Machiavelli, but reflecting an older recognition that these reigns were relatively stable and well governed compared to what came before and after. The 5 were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. The key feature of this period was that each emperor adopted his successor rather than passing power to a biological son. Trajan was adopted by Nerva, Hadrian was adopted by Trajan, Antoninus Pius was adopted by Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius was adopted by Antoninus Pius. The system worked in part because none of the first 4 emperors of the sequence had a suitable adult biological son, which removed some of the dynastic pressure that had produced rulers like Caligula and Nero in the earlier Julio-Claudian line. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, was the most militarily active of the 5. He led 2 major campaigns against the Dacians, a people living in what is now Romania, and turned their territory into the Roman province of Dacia. He also campaigned in the east against the Parthians, reaching the Persian Gulf, though his eastern conquests were abandoned by his successor. Trajan's column in Rome, still standing in its original location, is carved in a continuous spiral of relief sculpture, recording the Dacian campaigns in cinematic detail. Soldiers building a camp, crossing a bridge of boats, fighting in close quarters, Dacian cavalry charging, prisoners being led away. It is approximately 200 meters of carved narrative if the spiral could be unrolled and laid flat. Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 CE, spent more of his reign traveling the empire than any other emperor. He visited most of the major provinces, inspected the military installations on the frontiers, and took a personal interest in architecture and town planning. The wall in northern Britain bears his name. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome in its current form with the famous concrete dome. He built a massive villa complex outside the city at Tivoli that covered over 100 hectares and included reproductions of landmarks from his travels, including an Egyptian canal and a copy of a Greek philosophical garden. Hadrian was deeply interested in Greek culture, like wore a beard in the Greek fashion at a time when Roman emperors had been clean-shaven for centuries, and is the first in a line of emperors who adopted the beard, which became a conventional element of imperial portraiture. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180 CE, spent much of his reign fighting defensive wars on the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes. He wrote, in Greek, a set of philosophical reflections now called the Meditations, which were a private journal and were not intended for publication. They record his attempts to apply the principles of Stoic philosophy to the practical realities of power. The book covers his thinking on self-discipline, the transience of life, the importance of duty, the equal worth of all rational beings, and the need to maintain equanimity in the face of things outside one's control. It is one of the most widely read works of ancient philosophy in modern times, and is read mostly as a self-help text, which would probably have confused its author. Marcus Aurelius had a biological son, Commodus, who succeeded him in 180 CE. Commodus was a poor emperor by most measures, more interested in performing in the arena as a gladiator than in administration and warfare. His reign ended with his assassination in 192 CE, and the following year saw 4 different men claim the imperial purple in quick succession, a pattern that would repeat itself more frequently as the empire aged. Crisis, plague, and the 3rd century. The 3rd century CE is the period that Roman historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a stretch from 235 to 284 CE, during which the empire experienced near-continuous civil war, external invasions on multiple frontiers simultaneously, economic disruption, and a catastrophic plague. The plague, known as the Antonine Plague, in its first wave in the 160s CE and the plague of Cyprian in its second wave in the 250s killed millions of people across the empire. The sources describe high fever, diarrhea, vomiting, and a rash or pustules that suggest the Antonine Plague may have been smallpox, and the plague of Cyprian possibly something else, possibly measles or a viral hemorrhagic fever. Modern scholars estimate that the Antonine Plague alone may have killed 5 million people. A papyrus from Egypt records villages that had been almost entirely depopulated by the disease. The army lost soldiers faster than it could replace them with trained recruits. During the crisis of the 3rd century, the empire fragmented at various points into competing regional powers. The Gallic Empire, based in the western provinces, operated independently from 260 to 274 CE. The Palmyrene Empire in the east, under the leadership of Queen Zenobia after her husband's death, controlled Egypt and much of the Near East from 270 to 273 CE. Both were eventually reintegrated into the Roman framework by the Emperor Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 CE and spent almost his entire reign in the field, fighting one campaign after another to hold the empire together. In the 50 years from 235 to 284 CE, the empire had over 20 men who claimed the title of emperor, most of them soldiers who were proclaimed by their troops on a frontier and then killed by those same troops or by a rival claimant within a few years. The economy suffered. As the silver content of the coins was reduced repeatedly as the state struggled to pay its soldiers. Inflation followed. Long-distance trade contracted as roads became less secure and demand fell. Some towns in the western provinces show archaeological evidence of shrinkage in this period, with buildings falling into disuse and not being rebuilt. The empire survived the 3rd century crisis, which is itself worth noting. Other empires have not survived equivalent shocks. What kept Rome together was partly the army, which, fractious and murderous as it was in this period, continued to function as a military force capable of repelling external threats. It was partly the administrative infrastructure, the roads, the provincial governments, the tax collection systems, which continued to operate even when the top of the hierarchy was in chaos. And it was partly the sheer weight of Roman economic and cultural integration, which made secession from Rome less attractive than it might otherwise have seemed. Diocletian, Constantine, and the reorganized empire, the Emperor Diocletian, who took power in 284 CE and ruled until his voluntary abdication in 305 CE, the only Roman emperor to retire in anything like a normal sense, undertook a fundamental reorganization of the empire's administrative and military structure. He divided the empire into 4 administrative units, each governed by one of 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. This system is called the Tetrarchy. He expanded the army significantly. He reformed the tax system to be based on standardized units of agricultural production rather than the varying monetary assessments of earlier centuries. He reorganized the provinces into smaller units and doubled their number, reducing the power of any individual provincial governor. Diocletian also launched the last major persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. Christianity had been growing steadily since the 1st century CE, beginning in Judea and spreading through the Jewish diaspora communities around the Mediterranean and then beyond them. By the late 3rd century, Christians were present in significant numbers in most major cities of the empire and in some rural areas as well. The persecutions under Diocletian from 303 to 311 CE were the most intense the Christian community had faced, involving the destruction of churches, burning of scriptures, imprisonment of clergy, and in some areas, execution of those who refused to perform traditional Roman religious rites. The persecutions were inconsistently applied across different parts of the empire and ultimately ended without eliminating Christianity. Constantine, who became the sole ruler of the empire in 324 CE after a decade of civil wars within the Tetrarchy, had issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE together with his co-emperor Licinius, granting tolerance to all religions in the empire, including Christianity. Constantine himself converted to Christianity, or at least aligned himself strongly with it, and provided state support for the church. He funded the construction of major churches, including the original Basilica of Sion, Peter in Rome, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He called and presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which was intended to resolve theological disputes within the church, particularly the Arian controversy about the nature of Christ's relationship to God. The decisions at Nicaea became the foundation of Orthodox Christian theology in the major churches. Constantine also founded a new city. He chose the site of the Greek town of Byzantium on the Bosporus, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, and built a new capital that he called Constantinople. The city was dedicated in 330 CE. It had all the features of a Roman city: a forum, a hippodrome for chariot racing, palaces, public baths, and aqueducts. built quickly and sometimes with architectural elements brought from older cities around the empire. Constantinople had a profound strategic advantage over Rome. It sat on a peninsula bounded by water on three sides, with a natural harbour called the Golden Horn on one side and the Bosporus on the other. It was defensible in ways that Rome, sitting inland on its hills, was not. The Western Empire and its end. The division of the empire into Western and Eastern administrative halves became permanent in practice after 395 CE. The empire had been administered jointly before with multiple emperors, but the death of Theodosius I in 395 CE left the west to his young son Honorius and the east to his other son Arcadius. The two halves never reunited under a single ruler. The western half faced more immediate military pressure. The Visigoths, a Gothic people who had been settled within the Danube frontier as Roman allies in the 370s following pressure on them from the Huns farther east, rebelled in 376 CE after being mistreated by Roman administrators who took their food and sold them their children back as slaves in exchange for food. The subsequent war ended with the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, at which the Visigoths killed the Eastern Emperor Valens and destroyed a Roman army in the field. It was the worst Roman military defeat since Cannae, 6 centuries earlier. The Huns were a steppe people from Central Asia who had pushed westward through the Eurasian grasslands in the mid-4th century, disrupting and displacing the Gothic and other Germanic peoples who lived north of the Roman frontier. Under their most capable leader, Attila, who ruled from around 434 to 453 CE, the Huns raided deep into both the eastern and western halves of the empire. Attila's army reached Gaul in 451 CE and was checked at the Catalonian plains, modern Chalon-sur-Marne in France, by a combined force of Romans and Visigoths under the Roman general Aetius. The following year, Attila invaded Italy, sacking several cities in the Po Valley. He did not take Rome, pulling back apparently due to a combination of disease in his army, supply difficulties, and a diplomatic encounter with Pope Leo I, whom later tradition credited with talking Attila out of sacking the city. Attila died in 453 CE, possibly from a nosebleed on the night of his wedding, according to the chronicler Priscus. The Western Empire in the 5th century was shrinking both in territory and in institutional capacity. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were increasingly breached. Germanic leaders and their followers settled in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, sometimes as nominal Roman federates and sometimes as outright conquerors. The city of Rome itself was sacked twice, by the Visigoths under Alaric in 410 CE and by the Vandals under Gaiseric in 455 CE. These events shocked the Roman world profoundly. The city had not been taken by an enemy in 800 years, since the Gallic sack of 390 BCE. The date traditionally given for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 CE, when a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with a message that one emperor was sufficient for the whole empire. It is a reasonable marker, but somewhat arbitrary. The western provinces had been fragmenting for decades before that date, and the Eastern Empire, which regarded itself as the continuous Roman Empire and called itself that, continued for nearly another 1,000 years. The Eastern Empire and the long continuation. Constantinople sat at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, controlling the trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The eastern half of the empire had more cities, more agricultural wealth, and a more developed monetary economy than the West. It also had a more stable succession in the 5th century, partly through luck and partly through the skill of certain advisors and administrators who managed to keep the court stable while the West disintegrated. Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE, made a major effort to recover the western provinces. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in a campaign of 533 to 534 CE and Italy from the Ostrogoths in a longer series of campaigns that lasted from 535 to 554 CE. The Italian campaigns were particularly destructive. The back-and-forth fighting devastated the Italian peninsula, destroyed the remaining senatorial aristocracy that had continued to function under Ostrogothic rule, and left the country weaker than it had been before the reconquest. Justinian's greatest lasting contributions were his legal codification, the Corpus Juris Civilis, and his building program. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople, was built between 532 and 537 CE to replace an earlier church burned in a riot. Its dome, spanning about 31 meters, was the largest in the world for nearly 1,000 years. The architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus used a system of half-domes and penintives to carry the weight of the main dome down to the walls, a structural solution that allowed the base of the dome to be pierced with a ring of windows, filling the interior with light that gives the impression the dome is floating. The building is now a museum, having been a mosque from 1453 to 1934. Justinian's reign also saw the outbreak of the Plague of Justinian in 541 CE, the first pandemic caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same organism responsible for the Black Death of the 14th century. The plague arrived in Egypt, probably from Central Africa through the Red Sea trade routes, and spread rapidly through the empire. It returned in waves for the next 2 centuries. The modern DNA analysis of skeletons from 6th century graves in Bavaria, France, and England has confirmed the presence of the bacterium. The demographic and economic effects were severe. The empire that survived Justinian was smaller and poorer than the one he had inherited. The great reconquests in the west were gradually lost again. The Lombards moved into Italy from the north in 568 CE. The Visigoths retook southern Spain. North Africa remained Roman for a century more. The eastern frontier was under constant pressure from the Sassanid Persian Empire, and the two empires fought a prolonged and mutually exhausting series of wars in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Then, in the 630s CE, armies from the Arabian Peninsula, unified and energized by the new religion of Islam, struck the borders of both the Roman and Persian empires simultaneously. The Persians collapsed entirely within a decade. The Romans lost Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and eventually North Africa over the following century. The empire that remained centered on Constantinople and controlling Greece, Anatolia, and parts of the Balkans is what historians call the Byzantine Empire, a modern label that the people who lived in it never used. They called themselves Romans and called their state the Roman Empire until Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 CE. What they built in the ground. The evidence for Rome that does not depend on written sources is distributed across an enormous geography. It sits in museums, in archives of inscriptions, in storerooms of pottery fragments, and above all, in the ground. Field archaeology conducted across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East over the past 2 centuries has accumulated a picture of the Roman world that supplements and sometimes corrects the written record. Pottery is particularly useful because it is nearly indestructible. It changes shape and style over time in ways that can be dated with some precision, and it was made and traded in huge quantities. Fine red pottery, called terra sigillata, or Samian ware, was manufactured in large workshops in Gaul and elsewhere, and distributed across the empire. Finding a shard of terra sigillata at a site tells the archaeologist that the site was occupied during the period when this pottery was in use, and was connected to the trade networks that distributed it. Coins provide date brackets. A coin cannot have been deposited before it was minted, so finding a coin of a particular emperor in a layer of soil gives a terminus post quem, a point after which, for that layer. Coins from Roman sites turn up across the empire and beyond its frontiers, in Germanic territories north of the Rhine and Danube, in Scandinavia, in India and Sri Lanka, where Roman traders reached through the Indian Ocean networks, and in the graves of peoples who never came under Roman rule but valued Roman silver. The organic materials, wood, leather, cloth, food remains, are generally preserved only in particular conditions. Waterlogged deposits, as at the fort of Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, preserve wood and organic material because the lack of oxygen prevents decay. The The volcanic ash from Vesuvius that buried Pompeii and the smaller town of Herculaneum in 79 CE preserved buildings to their upper stories and preserved organic materials including food in sealed vessels, wooden furniture, textiles, and the cavities left by decayed human bodies that were filled with plaster by early excavators to produce the famous casts. Pompeii and Herculaneum are extraordinary, but also unusual, being a snapshot of a particular moment and place rather than a continuous record. What they show is a prosperous Roman provincial town of the 1st century CE in Italy, with a mixed economy of agriculture, commerce, and small-scale manufacturing. The town had elected magistrates, a forum, 2 theatres, an amphitheatre capable of holding 20,000 spectators, multiple bath complexes, hundreds of shops, and a large number of taverns called thermopolia, which sold hot food and drink from counters with built-in ceramic pots kept warm in the masonry. The walls of buildings carried painted election notices, advertisements for gladiatorial games, declarations of love, insults, poetry quotations, and accounts of business transactions. Graffiti on walls records the names of gladiators and horses, the victories of local sportsmen, and the opinions of passers-by on a wide range of subjects. Religion in the Roman world. The Roman religious world before Christianity was polytheistic and generally tolerant. The Romans identified their own gods with the gods of the peoples they conquered. Jupiter was identified with Zeus, Mars with Ares, Venus with Aphrodite. A conquered people's gods were not suppressed. They were added to the Roman religious landscape, often with temples in Rome itself. The state religion centered on keeping the gods well disposed toward Rome through regular sacrifices, festivals, and prayers conducted by specialized priests and priestesses. The College of Pontiffs and the various other priestly colleges were staffed by members of the political elite, and the offices were compatible with secular political careers. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, was often the most powerful political figure in Rome. Julius Caesar held the office. Augustus held it and every emperor after him until Theodosius I in the late 4th century CE, when the title was effectively taken over by the Pope of Rome, who still holds it. Mystery religions from the East became popular in the empire during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. The mysteries of Isis from Egypt, the Mithraic. Mysteries with their underground chapels and bull sacrifice imagery found particularly popular with soldiers, and various other cults offered personal relationships with divine figures, rituals of initiation and purification, and the promise of a better afterlife. They coexisted with the state religion without particular conflict. Judaism was a special case. The Jews of the empire were given exemptions from the requirement to sacrifice to Roman gods, recognizing the monotheistic character of the religion and its antiquity. Jewish communities existed in most major Roman cities, held their own courts for internal disputes, and maintained connections with the temple in Jerusalem and later, after the temple's destruction by Titus in 70 CE, following the Jewish revolt, with the rabbinic academies in Palestine and Babylonia. The destruction of the temple was a defining event in the development of rabbinic Judaism, which shifted the focus of religious practice from temple sacrifice to prayer, scripture study, and the interpretation of law. Christianity emerged within this context and borrowed some of its organizational and theological vocabulary from it. The early Christian communities in the cities of the Roman Empire met in private houses, shared meals, read letters from founders and missionaries, and elected their own leaders. They refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods, which brought them into conflict with the state when participation in state religious ceremonies was required. The persecutions that resulted were intermittent and of varying severity depending on the emperor and the local governor. The systematic empire-wide persecutions of the 3rd and early 4th centuries were exceptional. More commonly, Christians faced social discrimination and occasional local violence rather than coordinated state action. By the time Constantine offered imperial support to the church, Christian communities had developed extensive networks of bishops, deacons, and other clergy, owned property in many cities, and had built up a substantial body of theological writing and liturgical practice. Constantine's support accelerated an already existing trend. The proportion of the empire's population that was Christian had been growing for 2 centuries before the Edict of Milan. The language and the literature, Latin was the language of administration, law, and the military across the Western provinces. It was not imposed as a matter of explicit policy, so much as adopted by provincial elites who needed it to participate in Roman political and economic life. In the East, Greek had been the language of culture and administration since the Hellenistic period, and Rome accommodated this. Official documents in the eastern provinces could be issued in both Latin and Greek. Educated Romans learned Greek as a matter of course. Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations in Greek by choice. The Latin that survives from the classical period represents a high literary register. The prose of Cicero, the poetry of Virgil and Horace and Ovid, the history of Livy and Tacitus and Suetonius. These were works aimed at educated audiences and written in a polished style that was already somewhat artificial in its own time. Spoken Latin, the language of the street and the farm and the army camp, was different and changed faster. The forms it took in different provinces diverged over centuries into what became French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, and the other Romance languages. The divergence was already underway in the classical period, preserved in graffiti and informal inscriptions that show the living spoken language rather than the literary standard. Virgil's Aeneid, completed around 19 BCE, told the story of Aeneas, a Trojan survivor who sailed west after the fall of Troy and eventually reached Italy, where his descendants founded Rome. The poem connected Rome's origins to the Greek epic tradition of Homer and provided the new Augustan Empire with an origin myth of appropriate epic scale. It was used as a school text almost immediately after its publication and remained a school text in the Western world for nearly 2,000 years. The opening words, Arma virumque cano, I sing of arms and a man, were recognized by every educated person in the Latin tradition. Cicero, who was killed in 43 BCE as part of the political violence following Caesar's assassination, left behind an enormous body of speeches, philosophical works, and letters. The letters in particular are remarkable for their frankness and immediacy. He wrote to his closest friend Atticus in a style that is intimate and unguarded, discussing his anxieties about the political situation, his family problems, his financial concerns, and his opinions of the people around him. The letters were preserved by Atticus and published after both men were dead. They give a picture of a Roman senator's inner life that almost nothing else from antiquity provides. Tacitus, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE, produced histories of the Julio-Claudian and Flavian emperors in a dense elliptical Latin style that is the opposite of Cicero's flowing periods. His annals and histories cover the period from the death of Augustus to the death of Domitian, and his treatment of the emperors, particularly Tiberius, is deeply skeptical. He had lived through the tyranny of Domitian and wrote with the awareness of what an emperor's unchecked power could produce. His Germania, a short ethnographic account of the Germanic peoples north of the Roman frontier, remains a primary source for the pre-Christian Germanic world. Though scholars debate how much of it is accurate observation and how much is a rhetorical exercise in noble savagery contrasted with Roman corruption. Pliny the Elder, who died in the Vesuvius eruption of 79 CE while trying to observe it from closer range and to help those trapped on the shore, wrote a 37-book natural history that is an encyclopedia of ancient knowledge about the natural world, agriculture, mineralogy, medicine, and the arts. It is an extraordinary compilation and an important source for what educated Romans believed about the world around them. Much of it is accurate in its broad outlines. Some of it is wrong. It includes serious zoology and also accounts of dog-headed men and people who used their enormous feet as sunshades. Be what remained. By the time the Western Empire faded in the late 5th century and the Eastern Empire reshaped itself into the medieval Byzantine state, Rome had been present in the lives of the peoples around the Mediterranean for the better part of a millennium. The marks it left were physical, institutional, linguistic, and cultural. The road network degraded without the maintenance funding that the empire had provided, but the roots remained. Medieval travelers followed Roman roads because they went where roads needed to go, and the engineering that laid them flat and drained them remained useful long after the surface stones had been robbed for other buildings. Many major roads in Europe and the Middle East follow the lines of Roman predecessors. The towns that Rome had founded or enlarged became the towns of the medieval world. London, Paris, Lyon, Vienna, Budapest, Cologne, Seville, Lisbon, Trier, Strasbourg. All of these had Roman phases, and all of them retained, at minimum, the street patterns laid down by Roman engineers and the prestige of continuity with the Roman past. The bishops of the Western Church, as the Western imperial structure dissolved, often took over administrative functions in their cities, filling the vacuum left by the departure of Roman officials. The Church's dioceses, its administrative divisions, followed the boundaries of the old Roman provinces and cities. Latin survived as the language of the Church, of law, and of scholarship across the Western medieval world. Every educated person in Western Europe from the 5th to the 15th centuries learned Latin as a matter of course. The legal systems that developed in the successor kingdoms of the Western Empire were influenced in varying degrees by Roman law. The Visigoths in Spain and southern France, the Franks in northern Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy. All produced law codes that blended Germanic custom with Roman legal principles. In the East, Constantinople remained a functioning Roman city for another 1,000 years after the Western collapse, continuing to call itself Roman and maintaining many of the institutions, the legal system, the bureaucracy, the imperial court, the urban life, the trade networks that Rome had built. When it finally fell in 1453 to Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire, the scholars who fled westward carried with them manuscripts of Greek philosophy and literature that had been preserved in Constantinople, while the Western world had largely lost access to them. Their arrival contributed to the intellectual revival in Italy that we call the Renaissance. The Roman Catholic Church kept the title Pontifex Maximus. It kept Latin. It kept the idea of a universal institution governing people of many different languages and cultures under a single spiritual authority, an idea that the Roman Empire had embodied in political terms. The organization of the Church, with its hierarchy of bishops, provinces, and a central authority in Rome, mirrored the administrative structure of the empire so closely that historians have argued the Church is the most direct institutional successor to the Roman state. The law that Justinian codified in the 6th century became the foundation of legal education in medieval European universities, when those universities developed from the 11th century onward. A student at Bologna, Paris, or Oxford in the 13th century learned Roman law as the basis of legal thinking, regardless of what the local customary law might actually provide. Concepts like the distinction between public and private law, the presumption of innocence, the right to face accusers, the categories of contract and property and obligation, are Roman legal categories that passed into modern legal systems through this chain of transmission. The Latin names of the months, the 7-day week, the calendar that Julius Caesar reformed in 46 BCE, and that was itself a modification of an Egyptian model. The system of telling time by hours of equal length that became the basis of modern timekeeping. These are Roman inheritances so embedded in daily life that most people who use them never register their origin. Stand anywhere in the former territory of the empire and look at what is around you. In Rome itself, the concrete dome of the Pantheon. In France, the aqueduct of the Pont du Gard. In Spain, the bridges at Alcantara and Merida. In England, the walls of York and the remains of the baths at Bath. In Libya, the Forum at Leptis Magna. In Jordan, the colonnaded street at Jerash. In Turkey, the library at Ephesus. In Israel, the theatre at Caesarea Maritima. In Tunisia, the amphitheatre at El Jem. These are the works of a state that organized, planned, taxed, and built on a scale that the ancient world had not previously seen and would not see again in the West for many centuries. The engineers who built them were solving real problems with available materials and understood structural principles well enough to produce works that have stood for 2,000 years. The workers who built them, free and enslaved, left no names in most cases, only the stones themselves. The soldiers who manned the frontiers, the tax collectors who counted grain in Egyptian villages, the lawyers who argued cases in provincial courts, the merchants who moved olive oil from Spain to the Rhine. the potters who turned out tens of thousands of standardized vessels, the women who ran estates and dedicated buildings in their towns. These people built the empire from the inside, when in the daily detail of work and exchange and law and custom. The emperors whose names we remember did not build it alone. They directed some of it, shaped some of it, accelerated or damaged some of it. But the empire was larger than any of them. It was a system of habits and relationships and physical infrastructure that kept moving under its own weight for centuries and left traces that the world is still following. That is where we leave it for tonight. A city of 7 hills that grew into a structure that touched 3 continents, wrote its language across 1,000 years of scholarship, set its roads into the landscape so firmly that satellites can still trace them from orbit, and deposited its law into the legal codes of countries that would not exist for another 1,500 years after its last Western emperor was deposed. The Tiber still runs brown and wide through Rome. The hills are still there. The Forum is still there, mostly ruins now, but still there. The flat, open space where the Republic began and where the empire announced itself to the world. A cat sleeps on a column base in the afternoon sun. The stones underfoot are the same stones that consuls and senators and slaves and merchants walked on. The sound of the city around it has changed a great deal. The weight of what happened there has not. Rest well. We will pick up another thread another night.